Hello, my name is Jake Nelson, and today I'm going to be going over a influential revolutionary leader in Mexico's history, and his name is Francisco Ignacio Madero. Madero was one of the most well-known revolutionary leaders in Mexico's history, and throughout this presentation I'm going to be covering two different books that cover his rise through his revolution and what he did to spark this revolution in Mexico's history. The two books I'm going to reference are Francisco A. Madero, Apostle of Mexican Democracy by Stanley R. Ross. This book approaches Madero's revolutionary time in a little different manner. It focuses more on the political aspects of the side of the revolution. However, it does also cover more of the broad details that are necessary in order for a student to understand this revolution. The next book I'm going to be covering is The Mexican Revolution of 1910 through 1940 by Michael J. Gonzalez. This book is a more broad book, seeing how it covers the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1940. There are many influential people from during this time period between 1910 and 1940 that helped lead up to the revolution. But Madero, is focusing more around the 1910 to 1914 era. He was president of Mexico from 1911 to 1913. So that it's more of a broad book than anything. Before we cover these two books, I believe that it's necessary to understand a few key elements of Madero before we go into these two books and how they cover him. The first was that Madero was Mexico's 33rd president, and he served this position from 1911 to 1913. The second thing you need to know is Madero sparked a revolution amongst the Mexican population, and he done this by pushing for land reform, which Mexico did not have at the time because they were currently under the Diaz regime. And under the Diaz regime, Diaz was president for 40 years, and under this regime, land reform was never really altered. All the wealthy landowners, which they owned plantation-like places called haciendas, and these haciendas were huge plantations that took up everything, and there were only a few people that owned these in Mexico, and these were the wealthy landowners, and they also controlled most of the politics that went on in Mexico. So Diaz realized that he didn't need to really work on land reform, because if he did, then he would be directly hurting what's keeping him in power. Madero also needed to know that he pushed for open elections in Mexico, and this is one of the big things that helped him actually become one of the biggest revolutionaries that's ever went through Mexican history. He wanted open elections so that the people have a say. Like I said, they'd been through the Diaz regime for the past 40 years, and Diaz did not want an open election because he wanted to maintain control. He made the argument that Mexico is not ready for an open election, and that without him, Mexico would fail. And the last thing you need to know about Madero is that he was eventually forced out of office, but he left a lasting impact on Mexico's history. He brought up the ideas of land reform, which the poor people in Mexico wanted, and he also brought up the idea of open elections, which the poor people in Mexico wanted at the time. And the poor people were basically the majority of Mexico. The first source that we're going to cover, the first book that I mentioned earlier, is Francisco A. Madero, The Apostle of Mexican Democracy by Stanley R. Ross. And like I said before, this really covers more of a political aspect of Madero's revolutionary time than anything. It starts out, Ross talks about how Diaz was in control for 40 years, and Mexico was ready for a political change. They wanted an open democracy. But because of the situation that the civilians were in, if you were not a wealthy landowner or owned a hacienda, you really had no say in politics. And what you said, they kind of just threw out the window. And they really wanted an open democracy, and they needed to change, but they didn't know who the right person was to step up and bring this through this. And this brought on Madero. Now, Madero was born into a wealthy landowning family. Ross clearly states that over and over. And he talks about how it seems crazy how he would end up going against the system in which he was a direct benefactor from. And like I said, it talks about the political aspects and Madero's time as a revolutionary figure, because he's stepping up from a position of wealth. He already has power, but he sees the much needed change in Mexico's system, that the poor people are suffering while the country's literally not moving forward at all. And it's funny to say this because Francisco Madero was an unlikely revolutionary because of this. And he's considered the apostle of the Mexican Revolution, and he had no intention of being a revolutionary. Throughout his time, though, this book talks about how he loses no opportunity to point out instances in which Madero showed an interest in the country's social and economic problems. Madero realized that the top of the country were in control and the bottom people, the poor people, did not have a say at all. And he saw what economic problems this was going to bring and how Mexico was in dire need of a revolution to happen to get rid of this Diaz regime, promote land reform, and just give the power back to the people, which he really wanted. Madero's failure, however, to understand the significance and strength of the forces he had was basically proved to be his undoing. Madero was too trustful of associates in the coalition government, which he established upon assuming the presidency, and it was vividly shown during the final tragic days of his revolutionary or regime, whenever he was betrayed by those upon who he relied the most. And Madero had great intentions. He wanted to give power to the people. He wanted land reform to get rid of this, basically a dictatorship that Diaz had put on Mexican people. And he really wanted that. This book really focuses on the political aspects of how he wanted to get Diaz out of power. He wanted to give the power back to the people. And this book was a really interesting read. It was easy to read because it uses language that is acceptable to almost everybody. And you can go through and read it, and it's a really easy read, and I really recommend it if you want to learn more about Madero and his political aspects of his revolutionary period. The second source that we're going to go over is called The Mexican Revolution, 1910 through 1940 by Michael J. Gonzalez. As you can see by the title, this is not specifically focused at Madero, but it does cover his early time periods from 1910 to 1913, 1909 to 1913. So, if you're looking for a quick overview of Madero's time in power, this is a great book to read because it goes into good detail, but it stays broad enough that it can cover every single Mexican revolution during that time period. This book covers like I said, it covers the entire system of Madero's rise in time and power, and it does this in a way where it focuses on the entire country of Mexico and how the whole country reacted to Madero's revolution and his start in the revolution. Gonzalez does a great job. He starts with he starts by talking how Madero was an upcoming threat to the Diaz regime, and how Diaz was basically a dictator over Mexico, and land reform was not happening while Diaz was in control, and the people were in dire need of land reform because they had no land that they could basically grow from. If you were poor, you stayed poor because basically the good fertile land were in the haciendas that the wealthy people owned. Like I said, this book goes directly with the book before because it talks about land reform and open elections more than anything. But again, Gonzalez also talks about open elections were wanted, and Diaz would not let it happen. Diaz knew if he did, that the Mexican people would vote him out because they were tired of everything that was going on. They were ready for a change. Madero, he behaved more like a political reformer than a social revolutionary, and Gonzalez does a great job during this book explaining exactly why this is. He explains that in the early battles were in good favor for Madero, and because of this, Diaz basically banished Madero to Texas, kicked him out of Mexico completely. But however, it did not stop Madero because he went to Texas, he got all his stuff together, got followers, and tried to still find a way to get back into Mexico and make this revolution happen because he believed so heavily that it was needed. Gonzalez also mentioned that Madero's first couple of political gatherings seemed to please the followers of Diaz more than the revolutionists, and it kind of made the revolutionists uneasy. And it's easy to see why this was in the first couple of political gatherings, because you got to remember, Madero grew up in a land-owning family, was a well-off, and he benefited from Diaz's regime. So he grew up on those ideas, so you can see the first couple of minutes, he's still trying to figure out exactly what the people want. And once he started to do this, the revolution really took on in full speed. Gonzalez also talks about each political battle that Madero faced and how the outcome that affected the revolution in the long run, excuse me. But he goes through each political battle in this, and he gives a brief over of all the. He goes through each one. He gives a brief excerpt or something. He talks about each battle and how each one of them was just a push more to the revolution and for Diaz to get out of power. He ends the chapter that he talked about Madero, about how he says that Madero helped spark a much needed revolution in Mexico society because they were repressed, they had no room to grow, the economy was stable, but it wasn't growing. And Madero saw how much this was important to the Mexicans in Mexico, and he done his best to to spark this revolution so that it would leave a lasting effect in Mexico's history. Those are the two books that I read and that I tried to get most of my stuff out of. However, I did add some additional sources that to look at. These sources cover a broad aspect of everything. They cover some biographies of Madero. Others cover some of his revolution and talk about how it might have been a good thing or how it might have been a bad thing. But these are just a few of the sources that I also looked at to help get a general idea of everything. So I really hope that this video was helpful and that you learned something from this. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.